It is my distinct pleasure today to welcome and introduce our guest preacher, Reverend Berndt. I first met Brooks when he was a doctoral student in homiletics at the Graduate Theological Union. I was a pastor at First Congregational Church of Berkeley. Brooks came to worship with us, and we supported Brooks in whatever way we could in his journey. After leaving Berkeley, Brooks was called to pastor First Congregational Church in Vancouver, Washington, where he completed his first book called Sounding the Trumpet: How Churches Can Answer God's Call to Justice. Brooks joined his church in answering the call to environmental justice, including a successful effort to transition the state of Washington away from its only coal plant. Since 2015, Brooks has served as the UCC's Minister for Environmental Justice, leading the Creation Justice Program for churches and representing our denomination in the wider environmental movements. It was good to catch up last night with Brooks over Indian food and also swapping stories not only of our Berkeley days, but also of being dads of two daughters. Welcome and thank you for being with us, Brooks. Our scripture reading today is the continuation of the creation story in Genesis. Last Sunday, we read up through the 5th day of creation. We already heard about the creation of light, sky, plants, the sun and moon and stars, and finally animals. So far, each day God says creation is good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all wild animals on the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, even buckthorn, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that God made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. May these words be to us our light and our life. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. When I first walked into this sanctuary just a few minutes before the service started, I was immediately struck by how bright and welcoming this sanctuary is. You are definitely not in the tomb waiting for the resurrection to happen. The resurrection is happening right here. Thank you for having me this morning. When Adam approached me at General Synod about preaching as part of a larger sermon series on evolution, I initially felt a bit challenged. The subject is a bit outside of my regular wheelhouse of environmental justice topics. I could see how it related, but for me at the time it was like pizza and calzone. They're very similar, they're both good, but I normally stick with pizza. If anyone else, if I had been asked by anyone else, I would have said, "That's all right, Adam, I'm a pizza man." But I like Adam a lot. So I said, sure, we'll do calzone. And I'm glad I said that because it caused me to stretch myself. and see today's scripture, perhaps the most commonly cited environmental scripture, in a whole new light. You could say that Adam spurred my spiritual evolution. And so the question that I want to put before all of this morning is this one: are we spiritually evolving as people of faith? Let me begin by offering a couple of stories that raised this question for me. While waiting to speak at an environmental rally last year, another speaker told me something fascinating. As part of his work for a university program dedicated to energy research, he invited a prominent coal mining CEO to a graduate level seminar. For the visit, these sharp and highly informed students prepared themselves with arguments to deftly rebut any climate denialism. They fully expected it with good reason. The actual encounter, however, was completely different than what they anticipated. The executive befuddled them with heartfelt declarations of how his corporation was doing the will of God. The students didn't know how to respond. And how are we to respond? What are we to make of such things? Does this represent who we are as people of faith? Are we or are we not spiritually evolving? Almost a week after hearing this story, I found myself speaking to a group of church youth about climate change at a UCC camp in Ohio. One of the youth, who appeared to be about 12 years of age, arrived with a passionate zeal to do intellectual battle with me. Evidently, the description of the workshop had motivated him to attend so that he could disabuse me of any ideas that I had about the relationship of fossil fuels to climate change. From the beginning, he wanted me to know that God gave us fossil fuels so that we, humanity, could use them. It's worth noting that at the time of this incident, the head of the EPA espoused a similar view in stating that the burning of fossil fuels provided a divine opportunity to be blessed, not cursed. What are we to make of this? Does this represent where we are today as people of faith? Are we not spiritually evolving? The Bible is typically cited as giving credence to these views that I've just mentioned. And this morning's scripture is the scripture offered in supporting the notion that the natural world around us exists primarily for our benefit and we can do with it whatever we want. One could say that the implicit view is that in relationship to all of creation, we are narcissistic tyrants. All this was made for us to rule over. Is this who we are? Are we spiritually evolving? The views that I have referenced have been criticized from a scientific perspective. Recently, in an interview, an evolutionary biologist pointed to religion as the source of the misguided belief that humans sit atop the peak of evolution as the supreme beings of the natural order, when in actuality we are just a small part of the larger tree of life. The way I sometimes think about this is that if a lot of us can be wiped out by something so small you have to look at it under a microscope, we probably should be humble. The scientists went on to note that while we are lucky enough among species to have our particular capacity for awareness, feelings, and thought, this brings with it a unique responsibility with regard to other species rather than a unique license for power over other species. So what are we as people of faith supposed to make of such discussions? Is the Bible just a relic of the past with harmful, outdated views of the natural world around us? Or is the problem not about the Bible, but rather how it's interpreted and used? Are we spiritually evolving? As seems to often be the case with Scripture that is used for all sorts of abusive reasons, our Scripture for this morning ends up having a different meaning when you put it in its original context and when you then pause to think about how to translate and transpose ancient words into our modern times. Here at the beginning of Genesis, we have what has been called by Walter Brueggemann a liturgical poem, with grand language about the cosmos and the beginning of time. It's celebrating God, and it's putting words to how a community understands God and its relationship to God. So how is God to be understood here? God in this passage is in the business of creating a world of harmonious order and goodness. Scholars have often described God as being like a big gardener. In fact, we're told a little later that God planted the Garden of Eden. That's how God brings life into existence. So if humans are made in the image of God, as our Scripture says, this is the kind of image we're carrying. A gardener who strives to create a harmonious order full of life and goodness. Now, I want to imagine a bit further the meaning and import of this. Imagine that we're all going to go on a field trip today. After worship, we march out the doors and file onto a bus together. And as we sit there, Adam announces from the front of the bus that a generous benefactor has just gifted McAllister Plymouth with a new plot of land on prime real estate. We are headed there now to take a look at it. When we arrive, we discover that the lot gifted to us has grown completely wild. From a conservationist perspective, wild can sometimes be a good thing. But in this case, we learn that the generous benefactor has gifted us the land with the idea that we will turn it into a community garden for the benefit of the surrounding community. In other words, as we receive this wonderful plot of land, we are asked to be its caretakers and gardeners. As we get off the bus, each of us is handed a pair of gloves and a gardening tool, a trowel, a rake, a weed whacker, and right away we get to work. There's no free lunch here, we have to earn it. Now, this imagined scenario points to the meanings of our Scripture held in its original context. When the Scripture uses words like dominion and subduing, think of that generously gifted plot of land. Don't confuse dominion with domination. In this context, dominion is about a responsibility entrusted to us. Don't think of subduing as the act of a conquering army, but as the work required to make the land fruitful and abundant. This image of a community garden is more than a quaint metaphor. It relates to our fundamental purposes as people of faith. Scholars have pointed out that our passage today can't be fully understood by itself. Its capstone is found in the following chapter when God issues our first calling as people of faith. God tells Adam that his number one job is to be the caretaker of the garden, God's creation. Often it's translated as to till and keep the garden, but some have noted that a more accurate translation is to say that Adam's first job is to serve and preserve the garden. Indeed, one scholar has argued that from the biblical perspective, it's more accurate to say that we are to be servants of creation rather than stewards of creation, which has a more managerial connotation. Acting as servants of creation is the exact opposite of being narcissistic tyrants over creation. It means that we are not to be all about meeting our own needs all the time. It means we are fundamentally about the interests of others and our surrounding world. So are we spiritually evolving? Perhaps in some ways we evolve by how we remember the touchstones of our sacred past. In our world, we could say that there are two kinds of peak experiences. There's the kind where you elbow, fight, and claw your way to the top of a self-serving, self-aggrandizing hierarchy. There's nothing spiritual about this survival of the greediest winner-take-all peak. But then there's another kind of peak experience. It's the kind that's about finding fulfillment, meaning, and purpose. It's the kind that's about finding a life of service and caring in the garden of God's creation. I believe this peak experience is also where we find what can anchor us, direct us, and guide us when the world at times seems to be stumbling backward and wayward, running amok with greed, callous disregard, and human narcissism. For this reason, I want to celebrate your becoming a Creation Justice Church. It's a sign of how spiritually evolved you are. At a time when our society needs such a witness the most, you have manifested and affirmed that caring for God's creation is integral to our DNA as Christians. It's not a passing fad, it's not a trendy cause, it's fundamentally who we are. It's our first calling. We are people who are not all about ourselves and feeding our own desires and interests. Our sights are instead directed outward with an eye toward justice, being in right relationship with God, right relationship with humans, right relationship with all of creation. Regardless of what others say and do in the name of Christianity, we know this to be at the core of our faith. It's what we continually strive to do. It's as old as the first pages of the Bible, and it's as relevant as this morning's headlines. In closing, I salute you, I celebrate you, and I look forward to witnessing your continued ministries. Amen.
You can only say so much in a sermon, so we're glad that Brooks has agreed to continue the conversation with us after worship, more about sustaining our work in environmental justice through our faith. Brooks will lead the adult forum, which will be in the Plymouth room just behind the sanctuary here following worship.